Susan Child was the founding principal of Child Associates, a landscape architecture practice that she started with her classmates at Harvard, Duncan Alford and Doug Reed, in the early 1980s, and that was active for about 3 decades until the mid-2000s. In the context of today's large global practices, Susan's firm was quite small, but it was also, we could think about it as a regional practice, with projects in the East Coast of the United States and in the Midwest, and project types in the small to medium scale, including residential work, institutions and campuses, parks and public spaces, and preservation projects. It is often said that Susan entered the field later in life. While it is true that she had raised her family before going to graduate school, and then opening her firm. However, Susan had worked for the Boston Redevelopment Authority in the 1970s, where she worked on the renovation of public spaces, on the introduction of community gardens in underserved communities, and equally important during those days of very decayed quality in our cities, she developed the street tree guide for Boston, which was titled The Greening of Boston, an excellent resource on urban trees. So by the time she entered graduate school in her late 40s, she was indeed quite knowledgeable and had interesting and important work to her name. It is important to put her early work in the context of Boston's urban history. Susan had witnessed what is called white flight from Boston to the suburbs, and the subsequent disinvestment in the public spaces of the city. It is in this context that she worked to restore the Boston Public Gardens, that she helped found the Friends of the Public Garden, a non-for-profit organization to fund the renovation and maintenance of the park, and that she pursued realizing the projects that I mentioned previously. This experience, together with her background in art history at Vassar and her studies at the Radcliffe seminars, prompted her to continue on to graduate school at the GSD and to more fully develop her career as a landscape architect. I do want to stress that Susan's generation of women who did so much for their cities were real pioneers. They had a vision for better and equitable cities and were advocates of urban life. I also must add that they were also real pragmatists. They knew their efforts had to be sustained over time. Susan was, for example, very proud of the fact that she convinced the city to install irrigation and lights in the city's community gardens. She understood that people who worked all day would only be able to tend to their vegetables and flowers after hours in the evening when they came back home, and that their program would fail unless this infrastructure would be put in place. How brilliant and ahead of the time was this? And that was Susan. She was pragmatic to the core, and this pragmatism had to do with an issue of accessibility, but also with aesthetics. She was committed to maintaining high quality public realm landscapes. I don't know of anyone that surpasses Susan's skill and sensibility in designing with plants. Susan could make a work of art with just 4 species of vegetation. I witnessed this over and over again in my years working for her. This is more astonishing today in the era of designing with plant lists that are enormous. And although I understand that today the discourse on biodiversity is the motivating factor, what has been lost is that planting now looks like stuff being thrown together rather than thoughtfully considered. Anyone can get a plant list and put things in the ground. It takes the convergence of horticultural and ecological knowledge coupled with artistic sensibility to make something that transcends merely planting. Simply said, with plants, Susan created art. But what kind of art? Susan believed that fundamentally, landscape architecture was the art of illusion. Something, of course, that comes out of her studies in art history, and knowing how paintings manipulate space for specific ends. Susan could make a tiny space look huge, a gridded set of trees look natural, as she did with great effects at South Cove. A flat space look hilly, and vice versa, or a new landscape look as if it had been there for a long time. In other words, she knew about perception and about how to manipulate spaces and the materials of landscape, and used horticulture to those ends. What is Susan's legacy? I can think of Susan's legacy along 3 lines. On the one hand, there is the work that is less visible to us, landscape architects, in the sense that it does not have her name publicly attached to it, but that had high impact in Boston and its communities. On the other hand, there are the projects that are highly visible to us in the publications and awards. Within 10 years of graduating from the GSD, she had already accumulated 13 awards from the ASLA. These include works such as South Cove Park in New York City, the Janney Garden in Vermont, a beautiful garden in Western Massachusetts that is a contemporary and very minimalist interpretation of a Shaker cultural landscape, Stan Hewitt Hall, the restoration of Edith Wharton's gardens in Lenox, Massachusetts, and many others. Finally, a third legacy would be that she offers an example for women to stay engaged and productive during child-rearing years. As we all know, today, women make 50% of all graduating classes in landscape architecture, yet a very small percentage stay in the field and much less have leading positions in firms. Susan's trajectory tells us that as long as one stays engaged and active, the arc of a career is long and admits different forms of practice and contributions to the field and to society.